Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. It's my great pleasure to welcome you here tonight. My name is Professor Neva Heitus, and I'm the Vice President at the Royal Society of Edinburgh for Life Science. Any of you who know me know that I'm actually a clinical geneticist with a background in biochemistry and then a medical degree. So we're very delighted to have experts here tonight for this discussion. This event is on behalf of the Royal Society and the Royal Society of Edinburgh. And we're here to explore, as you know, growing tomorrow's dinner. Should GM be on the table? Events such as this are being held around the UK, supported by the Royal Society. And so I think it's a particularly opportune moment to have this in Edinburgh, because it is a discussion that we've been hoping to have with Scottish Government. And so tonight, yet again, helps us set the scene. There is, you'll be pleased to know, a Twitter hashtag for tonight. So if anyone wants to tweet about the evening, could you please use the hashtag RS Food for Thought, all one word. And we're at either Royal Society or Royal SOCED, ROYALSOCED. Before we meet our panellists tonight, I'd just like to set the scene, and the scene is probably one that, coming from a non-expert, you're all far more able to set for yourselves. And the scene is really, as the title suggests, about food security or secure sources of food for the world, because we're well aware that this is one of the next century's global challenges. We know that by the year 2050, we'll have a population in the world of approximately 9 billion people. We know that global warming is resulting in increased water levels, which as a result is decreasing the amount of land that is available to us for our populations and for growing food crops. We know that in addition to this, the population is changing the habits that it has for eating, with increased income in certain countries, resulting in increased intake of proteins, etc. We know that crop production is becoming a problem with increased resistance to pesticides, with increased need for fertilizers, with nutritional problems, etc. We know that water, as well as land, is becoming less available. And so all of these issues inform the way you think about food for the future, the way farmers, the way scientists, and the way governments think about food security for the future. What we would like to do, therefore, tonight is think about food security and how we may ensure that there isn't a problem in 2050. And as a result of that, we're hoping that you'll be involved in an activity where we will look at a scenario and you will discuss it among your neighbours and come up with ideas as to how best governments in the United Nations may spend their money. Part of the conversation tonight is about the technique, genetic modification, and perhaps some of the discussion will be about the types of genes that have been put into plants using both crossbreeding and genetic modification. So we're going to have now a very short video, a 2-minute video, that attempts to explain these techniques so that we make sure that everybody has at least seen that information before we start the discussion. So the video.
Natural selection tends to favour plants that can compete for light, water, and nutrients, defend themselves from being eaten, and disperse their seed over long distances. These characteristics are in direct conflict with the goals of agriculture, where farmers want plants to invest as many of their resources as possible into making nutritious, easy-to-harvest products. Genetic improvement has been a central pillar of improved agricultural productivity for thousands of years, with modern crop varieties being much higher yielding and generally more nutritious than their wild ancestors. Even with our modern crop varieties, continued improvement is both possible and necessary to meet growing demand. New characteristics can be introduced into crops using either conventional crossbreeding or genetic modification, GM for short. The characteristics of all living organisms, such as size, colour and shape, are determined by their genes and their interaction with the environment. With improvements in our knowledge about which plant genes do what, we now know many genes that could contribute to improving sustainable food production. In some cases, conventional breeding will be the best way to deploy these genes. That is, by crossbreeding the crop variety with the plant that contains the genes providing these characteristics. In other cases, GM, where scientists take a gene and insert it directly into a crop, might be easier or indeed the only way they can be deployed. If you want to discover more about how GM is done, if it's safe and effective, or what GM plants are grown and where, you can find the answers to these and many other questions about GM in the independent fact-based Q&A available on our website.
Thank you very much. So we need you to know that this event's being audio recorded, so that if you wish to go back and listen again, that will be possible through our website. And before we begin to introduce the panellists and get them to tell us about themselves, I'd like to do a quick poll with the audience of what you currently feel about GM food, related crops, etc. So should we have GM on the table? And we're not taking a photo or recording your views at this stage. So could you put your hand up if you think, yes, GM should be on the table? And someone needs to count. Perhaps you could take your hand down and we'll have the others who think GM should not be on the table put their hands up, please. Thank you. Marie-Claude, you're counting. Yes, thank you. Excellent. Thank you very much, all of you. That was very helpful. It's now my great pleasure to introduce the panellists who are with us tonight. On my left is Professor Jim Dunwell. He is the Professor of Plant Biotechnology from the School of Agriculture, Policy and Development at the University of Reading. Thank you for being here. Next is Nick von Westenholz, who's the Chief Executive of Crop Protection Association. And I believe you said, Nick, that you were also a farmer. So thank you for being here. And lastly, Stephen Tyndale, who's Climate and Energy Policy Consultant and a former Director of Greenpeace UK. So again, great to have you all here. Thank you very much. What I'd like to do now is ask each of the panellists to spend roughly 5 minutes telling us a little bit about their background and their experience with GM. So, Jim, could I ask you?
Okay. I'm a kind of academic scientist now, and I've worked in research for over 40 years, originally at the John Innes Institute in Norwich. I then spent 10 years in the commercial sector before there were GM crops, and part of my responsibility was trying to develop the very first ones. As you probably know, GM technology was first made public in 1983. So we're 33 years on with the technology. That was a sort of a big day in the history of genetics, in plant genetics, because it meant that from that point on, scientists, if they wanted to, could put genes from one location, one crop, or even synthetic genes into another and reproduce them stably. So I was involved with that technology. Then 20 years ago, that was closed down in the UK, and we talk about the consequences of that perhaps later. And I spent the last 20 years working in the academic sector. So I worked for the Scientific Civil Service, the industrial sector, and now the academic sector. I was part of the working party for the Royal Society that put together this Q&A document that was referred to, and I've also produced reports for the government chief scientist on GM in the last few years. One of my kind of non-scientific but more regulatory responsibilities is that I sit on the committee called ACRE, which is the Advisory Committee for Releases to the Environment, which is part of DEFRA. And that advises the UK government on the release of genetically modified organisms. It includes plants, animals, genetic vaccines, whether we'll get onto those at the age of the technology, but those are equally important. The technology is now moving very, very rapidly. Although we don't have GM crops grown in this country, they are grown obviously widely around the world. We have very little scientific research left in the UK in the commercial area. That has gone either back to the US or to Southeast Asia. That's where the commercial investment is now. The UK is not quite a desert for GM technology, but is at a very low level compared with many parts of the world, and that's something which we should discuss perhaps later. So that's my background in a few minutes.
Thank you very much indeed. Nick, could you follow on, please?
Sure. Yes, well, as Neve said, I'm Chief Exec of the Crop Protection Association, and that's the trade body for companies involved in crop protection technologies like pesticides, etc., and also seed breeding, biotechnology, etc., and the sort of companies that you just heard that are no longer really active in GM in Europe because of the regulatory obstacles essentially to moving forward with cultivating GM. But I also farm, a small farm in Hertfordshire, arable farming, and so have some, I guess, insight really from a UK perspective of some of the challenges facing farmers today. I think, one of the things I always think of is it's interesting how increasingly technological farming is becoming. I mean, a lot of people, there may well be a number of farmers in the audience, but people who aren't familiar with farming are often surprised these days when they go on to farm and they get in the tractor cab or whatever it might be to realise actually how high-tech a lot of farming has become. You go into a tractor cab and it's basically full of computers these days, and pretty much they drive themselves. Certainly the whole area of precision farming and being able to map out fields, apply inputs in a targeted manner is very much becoming more and more common in farming. So technological innovations are key to farmers, and farmers are very keen to know what's coming down the line and actually to, if they're available and cost effective, to use those and jump on those. But farmers they've always been technical, by which I mean they've always needed to have technical expertise about what it is to grow a healthy and profitable crop, or to produce healthy and profitable livestock, certainly the better farmers. But it's, when it comes to, GM in particular, or let's say seed breeding and seed varieties, farmers for decades, for centuries, for millennia, however you want to look at it, have been selecting seeds which have certain traits which are advantageous to them. So now as an arable farmer, every year, I'm presented with a list, recommended list of varieties, whatever it might be, wheat, barley, rape, etc. And they will have a whole different range of aspects to them, whether that's some yield better than others, some have better pest resistance attributes than others, some have shorter stems and so are resistant to lodging or falling over in the field. All of these things are, go into the mix when farmers think about what they're going to, or arable farmers certainly think about what they're going to grow. But despite that, it's actually been very tough in the UK and Europe and elsewhere in the world, but specifically around here, because of what's generally termed as the yield plateau. From the war up until maybe 80s, 90s, agricultural yields, arable yields in the UK essentially increased by about 4% a year. There were some really significant increases. For the last 20 years or so, they've essentially stopped. So you're not really, as a farmer, getting any bigger yields with your wheat than you did 20 years ago. That's a really, really big problem. That's one of the main issues why we're having to have really important discussions about how we use technology to improve yields. You mentioned quite rightly this global picture of many, many more mouths to feed. 200,000 extra mouths to feed on the planet a day. Edinburgh is 450,000 people. That's 2.5 days to get a city the size of Edinburgh on the planet every day. That's how many more people. And productivity, improving production is part of the answer, as well as as was mentioned, waste and diets and all these other issues. So this is really for us as farmers, a key discussion, how we can really harness technology to kind of answer some of those food security challenges.
Thank you very much. And Stephen?
Thank you. I first became involved in the GM debate in the early 1990s when I was advising the then Shadow Environment Secretary, Chris Smith, who went on to become chairman of the Environment Agency. And I was drafting a policy paper for him, which was published as In Trust for Tomorrow, which looked at GM and said, it needs to be considered. There are some uses of genetic modification that look positive, such as pest resistance. There are some uses of GM that look less positive, such as pesticide resistance. So, case by case, empirical approach. I just drafted it. Chris got it through the Labour machinery, so that was the difficult bit. That has actually always been my personal approach to GM. It's not about the technology, it's about what it's going to be used for. I then went to work for Michael Meacher when he was Environment Minister, and Michael, great guy, very sad he died last year, he was ideologically opposed to GM, mainly because it was people like Monsanto doing it. So it was more a socialist opposition than an environmentalist opposition. And Tony Blair, of course, didn't do socialism, so he thought new Labour, new seeds, so let's support GM. So I spent the 2 years of working for Meacher drawing up the farm-scale trial programme. I then decided to leave working for Michael, and I negotiated with Peter Melcher, who was then running Greenpeace, to go and work for Greenpeace. And then after I'd accepted the job at Greenpeace, but before I'd left and started, Greenpeace and Peter himself went and ripped up one of the farm-scale trials that I'd spent 2 years designing. So that was interesting. I decided to take the job anyway. I would not take the job at Greenpeace if my position was, as it is now, that GM is a first-order issue. The need for GM is essential. At the time, I thought it was a second-order issue, and I was more interested in pollution, air pollution, and climate change. And so I decided I would take the job at Greenpeace. Greenpeace is a global top-down organisation, so people in one country can't change the global line. So even after I was promoted to replace Melcher and became director of Greenpeace UK, I couldn't change the Greenpeace global line on GM. What I could do is shut down the GM campaign in the UK, which is what I did, which was not particularly heroic, but that was in line with my then approach. I then left Greenpeace and went freelance, so I can actually say what I think now. And I spent some time working for the Centre for European Reform, and we did an event where Professor Anne Glover spoke when she was advising President Barroso, the former Commission President. And she gave a brilliant talk in which she said, first of all, it's not the whole solution, but it's part of the solution. And secondly, she said, compare and contrast the Green Group's approach to climate change and GM. Climate change, is it proven that humans are causing climate change? No, not absolutely. That's not how science works. Very little is proven in science. But about 95% of peer-reviewed studies on climate change say, yes, it is the result of human activity. So the Green Groups all say, we must act on climate change. Absolutely, we must. I'm with them on that. Peer-reviewed studies, is GM safe? About 95% say, yes, it is safe. Of course, it's possible to find some peer-reviewed studies that say it's not safe. So the Green Groups, far too often, latch onto one of them and say, look, it's not proven. The precautionary principle under the EU, often cited, the precautionary principle says assess the risks of action, but also assess the risks of inaction. And that second bit, green groups don't mention. The risk of inaction on GM is that many, many, many people will starve. Many children will die. That is not a risk I am prepared to take.
Stephen, thank you very much. Thank you all very much. Now, before you start to worry that you're not going to get a chance to ask questions and express views, that will come towards after the middle part of tonight. Just now we're going to have discussions among ourselves as I try to bring out various subjects that I think might be interesting for you. So I wanted to start by just asking you as panellists whether you think the general population might be confused between the technique, genetic modification, and the genes and their products which may be put into plants using GM. And I don't know, Jim, if you want to.
Okay, I think there is confusion. Part of it is because the regulations that are around the subject emphasise the methodology. They were written to regulate the method. They weren't written to regulate what the product of that method is. And so the method itself has achieved a sort of aura of suspicion in many people's eyes that by involving and manipulating so-called genes themselves, this is something intrinsically dangerous and suspicious. And of course, most people here realise that our present food, we really eat sort of major mutants. Crop plants are mutations of wild plants. So domestication has been the use and exploitation of major mutation over thousands of years. So that's why we benefit from large seeds and highly nutritious crops, is because somebody a long time ago made those decisions, not based on science, but they identified those major mutations. So our diet is made up like that. So using mutations, changing genes, was something that was done spontaneously because we're all mutating as we sit here. It's identifying beneficial mutations that was the foundation of agriculture. So the genetically modified plants as we see them are an extension of those techniques. They're maybe much more precise in the sense that now we know the DNA sequence of almost every major crop in the world. Just last week, another complete genome of the peanut was published. Every crop we eat now, we know from more or less from beginning to end every bit of DNA within it. So we can be much more precise, both in conventional breeding and in these kinds of techniques. So I think that understanding is often blurred. If you talk to groups, sometimes they say, well, everything we eat is GM. Sometimes they say, no, nothing is.
Yes. Thank you very much. Nick, I wonder if you could explore for us what sort of genes could we put into plants that would come to the table and would provide some further security for crop development?
Well, I mean, the couple of traits at the moment which are most prevalent in GM are insect resistance and herbicide tolerance, and there are now increasingly more interesting traits coming forward. For instance, drought resistance, which is very interesting in terms of concerns around water scarcity, which are concerns even in the UK, which is maybe surprising for people who've experienced the wet weather recently, but also nutritional benefits. So golden rice, which maybe somebody else might want to talk about, is one which essentially will introduce vitamin A into rice, which is going to be potentially beneficial for areas of the developing world where there is vitamin A deficiency. As a farmer, from my point of view, I mean, we're in Scotland and there aren't here the problems with blackgrass, for instance, that farmers in England are currently experiencing, but it's a really, really problematic weed. It may well be here in a few years' time, because it certainly wasn't as prevalent as it is now in England 5 or 10 years ago. And farmers it's a really, really big problem for UK farmers, blackgrass, how you deal with that. Chemistry is not proving particularly effective. There's resistance to that. Traits in crops that might help around herbicide resistance, for example, and allow farmers to tackle blackgrass issues more, would certainly be interesting to us as farmers, although herbicide tolerance is a controversial area.
Okay, thank you very much. Can I pass to Stephen then?
Yes,
Can you add regulation into your comments, please, and how we can do that to give us some confidence about the types of recipes we're putting into these crops?
Okay, I'll come back to that. But first of all, salt resistance is another interesting trait. Given sea level rise, we're going to have more saline-resistant plants to grow, and I think a lot of research is being done on that. Golden rice is potentially fantastic. It's not proven, it's not commercialised yet, but it is good for nutrition, and it's being largely funded by the Rockefeller Foundation and will be patent free. So those who oppose GM on the basis that it'll give more power to agribusiness, the Monsantos of this world, can't use that argument against golden rice. They still oppose it, but they have to find other reasons to oppose it. I think that regulation, the European Commission, who are not perfect, but they don't screw everything up, and they have actually come up, largely because of Anne Glover's work, they've come up with a sensible regulatory approach, which says that as long as the European safety authorities, food safety authority, passes something to be safe enough to sell to consumers or to grow, it should then be up to the national governments, the member states, to decide whether to do it or not. Germany, it'll never happen, but the UK, fingers crossed, I think it might.
Okay, thank you very much. Just to make sure we're all on the same page, so vitamin A deficiency in children causes blindness, and about 500,000 children have such blindness as a result of deficiency in their diet. Hence the imperative for the production of golden rice and the trials that are underway in the Philippines and Bangladesh, I think. So an example of where a great deal of good, I guess, could be done. And I guess the question I want to move on to is whether there are other ways that we could work that will help to improve nutritional value of rice, of other crops, whether there are other things we can do as farmers, agriculturalists, and whether these can be done quickly enough to help us solve the problem of a secure source of food for our population. I don't know, would you like to start, Jim?
Yeah, I think it depends also whether you're looking at a solution for the UK. I mean, most of us are probably overfed and, you know, we're not suffering nutritional deficiencies, I hope. Not too many, not obviously. Whereas the position in the rest of the world is quite different. Over the last couple of years, I've travelled around quite a lot of West and East Africa and looked at some of the really good work that's going on there, for example, in growing bananas and species like that, which are basic crops for those countries. And there are nematodes, these little slimy worms that live in the soil, to which there's very little genetic resistance conventionally. There are some really toxic chemicals you can apply. It can devastate crops of tropical crops. There are trials going on in Uganda, for example, where genes have been put in that provide really good levels of resistance to those soil pests. Those are critical issues where you have a crop or you don't have a crop. In the UK, we have pretty good yields of everything, but there are parts of the world where there are really significant benefits, which they're going well, but their view, looking at whether they should be approved, they sometimes look at Europe and say, well, why is Europe so suspicious? They look at us and admire the UK and say, well, the UK is distrusting, so it becomes increasingly hard for them then to get those products. through their own systems. So we've perversely imposed this irrationality on other people to whom it will be a far greater benefit. And so there are many examples. I could go on with fungal resistance in lots of crops where biofortification of not just vitamins but iron, which is a critical factor deficient in many people's diets. Undernutrition is just as much a problem as malnutrition. So a lot of people in parts of the world don't get the right balance of micronutrients. All of those can be approached through conventional breeding, but sometimes much more quickly through these kinds of genetic methods.
Nick, as the farmer who's here, as well as the chief executive of the crop group, could you tell us what else is going on to try to improve crop production and other plants that we eat production, and how GM fits into that scheme of things from your point of view?
Well, I mean, there's obviously conventional breeding still ongoing. I mean, it's not as if new traits and new varieties are not coming to market, but they, as you implied, I think in the question, they take a long time. Clearly, through genetic engineering and other GM-like techniques, speed is clearly a huge advantage. And you know, it is worth saying that farmers aren't just simply about, well, let's try and get hold of some GM seed, which will do the trick, and you know, apply some chemicals, and then sit back and wait and see what happens. You know, that, as I said at the beginning, there's an awful lot else being brought to bear. I mean, some of the precision farming techniques you see now, where you can map your fields, you can see where yields are going to be best in them. And therefore you can only cultivate those fields and get the best out of it, and maybe leave the rest to more environmental purposes, or you can see where you've got differentials in yields, or where you've got pest problems in parts of the field and where you haven't got pest problems, and then you're using less and more targeted pesticides. So there's all those sort of approaches. But I mean, I just also wanted to come back on the you know, on that point. I mean, it's absolutely right that in Europe and the UK, you know, I don't think anybody's going to feel particularly sorry for the plight of farmers necessarily, and there are really big concerns in the developing world. But there's a couple of points to make about that. Firstly, you know, a 1% drop in productivity in Europe means a drop in how much you can feed about 10 million people. So if you get productivity drops in Europe, do you think that means that people go hungry, or do you think that means we actually start sourcing food from elsewhere in the world? So actually productivity in Europe going down will put more pressure on the developing world, who already, as we've heard, struggling potentially to feed themselves. Secondly, actually, you know, I go back to John Bennington's perfect storm, you know, idea that with climate change, population growth, resource scarcity, many parts of the world, it's going to become more difficult to produce food, even if we can bring some of these technologies along. Europe, actually, comparatively, will probably remain a pretty benign part of the globe to produce food. So again, why in Europe would we, you know, undermine our capacity to produce food? I mean, actually, to me, we have a responsibility to ramp up food production. Of course, sustainably, of course, looking at the environment as well. But I think there is a problem, a global problem, if Europe undermines its capacity to produce food.
Very helpful, thank you. We've concentrated a lot on food security, Stephen, but there's clearly potential impacts on the environment, on the natural world. There are ethical questions. I mean, what are the problems out there that we're not addressing? What are the great unknowns that we still have to work on?
Well, the greatest unknown is how much the climate is going to change and what the effects of that are going to be. But just on the ethical point, I mean, some people believe that it is ethically wrong to create new life forms. New life forms have been created by conventional breeding, I know, but they regard this kind of scientific interference, quote unquote, as ethically unacceptable. That's not my view, but I understand and respect that that is other people's view, and therefore I think maximum labelling is an essential part of consumer acceptance, people should have choice so that they can avoid it if they wish to. And I know there's stuff about separation distances and when is something GM and when is something not GM. It's not easy, but every effort should be made to label. On climate change, well, first of all, if there's more pressure on the developing world or the world outside Europe, there'll be more deforestation, so that'll screw the climate even more. So that's another reason for us to be growing more in Europe. The soil is not only a producer of food, it is also a very good sink for greenhouse gases. So the way to improve its capacity as a sink is to till it less. The organic movement rightly says that that is a benefit of organic, but then there's the yield problem. So the challenge, I think, is to find a low till, low herbicide, pesticide use, high yield. And if that involves GM, I think that would be a decent bargain. On the herbicide point, I'd be interested in Nick's views on this. Roundup Ready. My view of Roundup Ready is it's not a problem because it's GM, it's a problem because it's Roundup. Because the WHO has said Roundup is probably carcinogenic. So I think it should be banned.
Nick, would you like to comment?
Yeah, I mean, as you I'm sure know, the WHO, or the committee of the WHO who said that also found, I think, hairdressing, aloe vera, and several other things probably carcinogenic, and the WHO and a number of other regulatory bodies have come to completely opposite conclusions. So I think certainly I think there's very little wrong with glyphosate. I think it's the argument currently around glyphosate use is incredibly surprising because it is a very safe and very low toxicity chemical. I mean, certainly much less than you know, wine or chocolate or all sorts of other things which we consume quite happily day to day. But having said that, you're right that the Roundup Ready, potential issues with Roundup Ready GM crops relate to the way that farmers subsequently use Roundup, glyphosate, herbicide, with it. And if it's used irresponsibly or badly, then you do have problems. And that, you're right, that's not about GM, that's about farmer behaviour. But it's not to say that actually we should learn the lessons and ensure that if you do get herbicide-tolerant varieties of, say, cereals or oilseed rape or whatever it might be, that the educational aspect of how to use it properly so that you actually reduce herbicide use. And initially, after the introduction of Roundup Ready crops, you did get a reduction in herbicide use. So actually, it can be a good thing. It doesn't mean to say that it always is or that farmer behaviour always leads to that. But Roundup Ready crops can lead to a reduction in herbicide use, which must be something we want.
Thank you both. I'd like to start the audience participation in a moment, but just one final question, and it's around a statement that was made last year when the Scottish Government decided that we wouldn't be able to grow crops with any GM genes products in them. Do you think that the use of genetic modification to put new genes or recipes into food products can be clean and green? Jim?
Okay, I think it can. Some of the reasons we've discussed before, it's the methodology distracts you from the end point, and the focus should be on the end point. And I think it's what you put in and what the product is that comes out and what its agronomic performance is and what its environmental impact is, if it has one or not. So I think by having a blanket ban on a technology, you're removing from your own opportunity things that can be beneficial to both farming and indirectly, therefore, to us, or to, in this case, to Scotland, because by increasing the performance of agriculture, you increase financially the output of the whole country. So I think it's short-sighted to have an embargo which is not based on evidence but on a statement that says, I'm suspicious, but there is no evidence, scientific evidence for that blanket suspicion.
Thanks, Jim. Either of you want to add to that?
I would say, yes, it should be supported on a pragmatic, evidence-based, case-by-case regulatory approach, but that is not a great political soundbite, so it probably won't happen.
Thank you very much. Now, what I'd like to do now is to get you to consider the interactive activity we have for you. If you do not have a sheet like this, could you raise your hand? Of course, there are other copies, one at the front, Marie-Claude, one at the back. Another one at the front here, yeah? Or several at the front. And you'll see when you get a copy that there is a scenario for the year 2090 and that you're on the UN and you have $1 billion to improve food production. On the back you'll see, that's a very short amount of money, I think. On the back you'll see potential ways you could spend your money, and we would now like you to talk among yourselves. And if you're sitting next to someone you know who has similar views, please talk to someone else, try to have a group discussion, and we'll then ask for comments back and questions that you may have around these issues. So please take 10 minutes to do this. The panel is going to wander around and help with the discussion or add to the discussion, etc. So thank you. Please, we'll go on till around 7:25. What we're trying to do, and I probably won't express this correctly, is provide evidence. And what we haven't managed to do is provide perhaps some of the more ethical debate which many of you will be interested in. A lady on the right-hand side down here has raised the very important issue of how much of the evidence that we keep talking about is actually independently done without the support of industry. And where it is industry funded, she's wondering whether that data that comes from their trials is freely available for other scientists to use when they're trying to prove or disprove the evidence. So I think there are a number of questions around the independence of this group and their ability to convince you that they're not skewed, excuse me, I didn't use an Australian word there, I nearly did. Skewed in terms of their point of view. Now, because Stephen has been in Greenpeace, although I know he's mentioned how his views have moved, I wonder if you could help us out, Stephen, and comment perhaps on what we've been lacking here in this debate.
Well,
I don't know if you can.
I'll do my best. First of all, there is the ethical line that I did try and outline, that it's just wrong to interfere with nature. That is part of it. Then there is the view that GM will always escape, even contained use GM, for medical purposes. Some of it will get out and then contaminate the environment. Then there is the view that it will lead to more intensive farming and therefore a move away from, further away from organic. And that leads on to the fear that it will lead to more damage to the natural environment and to wildlife and to plants from pesticides and herbicides. That is all the green stuff.
What about food sovereignty?
Sorry, say that again.
The food sovereignty, that the power falls into the hands of the GM development.
I was just coming
Food
on to
sovereignty.
that. That is the green argument, small g. And then there's the kind of more social policy and anti-capitalist, frankly. And the idea that, Monsanto are evil bastards. Well, they might be, no comment. But it's not an environmental argument. it's an anti-capitalist argument,
And the gentleman at the back who asked the question about patenting of GM crops making the population poorer was one of the questions relating to that.
Firstly, the developers do say, genetic modification is not free. Therefore, we have to put a lot of R&D money into it, and therefore patents are necessary for us to recoup that money. Patents mean that seeds are less readily available. Terminated technology, incidentally, that's worth mentioning. That's something that Monsanto was working on, where it doesn't produce seeds. So farmers need to buy seeds the next year, and if that had been rolled out in the developing world, that would have been catastrophic because farmers rely on seeds because they can't afford it. Monsanto's line was they were going for terminated technology, so they weren't producing an artificial life form. It wasn't something that could reproduce itself. Mm-hmm. Therefore, they were answering Greenpeace. Well, who knows? But anyway, they're not working on it anymore. But the patenting issue, it's, to me, and I may be wrong, it doesn't appear to me a major problem in the UK. But in India, where I've done some work as well, it is a major problem because there's a lot of very poor farmers.
Okay. Now, I've opened it up a little bit. I know I haven't done that job well, but what I'd now like to do is make sure we open it up to you to talk about, if you would like to, the scenario that was set for you, or to explore with the panel and each other the questions that raised in your minds. So who would like to begin? And Marie-Claude has a microphone. Could you wait to speak? So 1, 2, 3, 4 at the moment. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. So in the middle is 1. Thank you.
You want a name?
If you would like to say yes, a name and a background.
James Gilmore, former Director of the Agricultural Advisory Service of Scotland and former member of the British Crop Protection Council. 2 points on just purely on the ethics at the moment. One is, I wonder how many of the vegetarians who campaign so vigorously against all forms of GM, which I don't necessarily support, realise that their hard cheeses that they buy every week in the supermarket, labelled suitable for vegetarians, are all produced by GM technology. The enzymes that produce those cheeses do not come from sheep's stomachs. They come from GM bacteria. The other point that's been raised about ethics is funding of trials work and funding of commercial work. I was involved in that when I was head of crop protection. And the British government decided that where there was a recognisable end user, be it a chemical company or a farmer, they should have to pay for work that was previously funded in the public interest. So trials work that we did, evaluating varieties, evaluating modern pesticides, had to be funded by somebody, not out of the public purse.
Were you able to publish those results
yes,
freely?
Yes, we were. But the key point was, why did those chemical companies come to us in the public sector to undertake these trials? Because our independence and impartiality was of enormous value to them. If we did anything stupid and damaged our independence and integrity, we would no longer be of any value to them whatsoever, never mind to the other stakeholders whom we had a duty to serve.
Thank you very much indeed. The second question was further back. There's 2 people back there wanting to ask a question. Number 2, can you raise your hand, please? Yep. Anyone who'd like to be number 2, put up your hand. Okay. Then 3's here, 4, 5, and 6, something like that.
Stephen raised quite an interesting point just now. We see there be an interesting dilemma. I don't know of any evidence at all, on the one hand, that this technology is dangerous. Nothing at all, anyway. And as one point, I don't like the blanket term GM because it has so many meanings. But that's one issue. On the other side of the equation is here we have a technology that can do so many good things, but on the other hand, we might have a regulatory system, patents, and all the rest of it that actually may deny most people access to this technology. So can you make a comment on that? Maybe Stephen, I don't know.
Thank you.
Sorry, I didn't catch that. Just say it again, please.
You raised earlier an interesting dilemma. On the one hand, the technology is very powerful and I believe it's very, very safe. I don't know of any evidence to say it's not.
Yeah.
On the other hand, the commercialization, the use of patents, etc., might deny, for example, the use of crops generated in this way to be used in the developing world, where it's obviously very critical it's used.
Okay, got it. Thank you.
What a comment.
Okay. Well, firstly, on veggie cheese, I think the answer is probably very, very few know that. It's not widely known, and they wouldn't want to know it. On the commercialisation point, I think there needs to be more public sector money, money that goes on, well, climate change money. The developed world has promised £100 billion a year, sorry, $100 billion a year by 2020 to be spent on climate change, both on cutting emissions and on dealing with climate change. Some of that money should be invested in development of new crops, and a number of developing country governments are arguing for that. So I think there is this dilemma with private sector companies needing patents to recoup their investment. And the only way I can see around that is to have public sector investment in the research and development. Just on the point about are we independent or are we lackeys or whatever? When I wrote a piece saying GM should be pragmatic and case by case, I was attacked and somebody said, "Are you in the pay of Monsanto?" To which the answer is no. I have not been offered any money by Monsanto, and if they did offer it, I would not accept it. Not because of GM, but because they're agribusiness, and I'm not a big fan of agribusiness.
Excellent. Now, we do have other questions, but I'm very aware that I am failing in my duties here because this section was to be you telling us about your strategy for saving the world. So if any of you that I target have any views on that strategy as well, it would be excellent. Gentleman at the front.
David Stevenson, retired from a career in tropical medicine and public health, which involved, to some extent, living in villages in Africa and Asia. Now, much of the world's food is produced by small farmers, subsistence farmers, feeding their own families. I used to set an exam question for postgraduate public health workers that the green revolution will lead to a red revolution. I wonder whether any of the panel have any view on this, because if you change the way people grow their food, then you tend to make a few people richer and a lot of other people poorer. And there are considerable implications of this. It's not a simple matter of planning here what we should do there.
No, but it does contribute to what we should be doing by the year 2070 or whatever it was.
I think we should be very reluctant to ask people to make major changes in the way in which they carry out traditional farming. One particular point on that thing, veganism. Eating more vegetables, yes. Trying to be vegan, I think, is totally impractical, except in very rich countries. Certainly, and the question of golden rice arose. It's a good idea, but is it easy to get communities which grow their own rice and live on it to change the form of rice that they grow? There are all sorts of implications about the price of the seed and who provides it and who organizes, whether they get 2 crops a year or 1 crop a year, and whether it disturbs the relationships between landlords and tenants, which can well lead to the red revolution.
Breakdown. Thank you very much. Very sensible comments. Nick, I don't know. Sorry.
The comment at the back.
Yes.
Take that as well.
Yes. Is that
I think there's some
similar?
elements
Okay.
of-
Yes, please.
Hi, hello, thank you. Andrea, just a member of the general public, interested in science, discovery, history, and I just think these debates are important. The panel could be wider, have people on who can represent or have experience in education of women in different countries, different choices, life choices, because thinking in simple terms, the debate like GM or climate change, it's like just moving the chairs on the Titanic when the best thing to do is to steer the Titanic away from the iceberg, which is kind of like instead of letting population explode, there's ways that people might want not to have children.
Thank you. So that contributes to our debate on that. You would see that's a good investment that the world should be making in controlling the population. Thank you very much indeed. No, very helpful. And very helpful in terms of future debates. And this one, as you heard, is in conjunction with the Royal Society of Edinburgh, and was specifically around, food security and GM as a technique for putting in genes. So I guess that has been the flavour of the panel, but we understand exactly what you're saying. There is a gentleman on this side with his hand raised, and then at the front.
Thank you. I'm Andrew Wilson, recently retired head of unit at the European Commission, so I thank Stephen for his kind words. I have a point to make on your exercise, but first I have a more important point to make about the announcement by the Scottish Government last year that they would use this new legislation, new European legislation, to ban the cultivation of GM products. This is an empty and meaningless declaration because they cannot. The legislation applies only to member states. It's only a member state government that can take measures to restrict or ban the cultivation of GM crops. So the Scottish government would have to persuade the UK government to do it on their behalf, and good luck with that. My comment on the exercise is that it's an expenditure of £1 billion in 2090. But I rather think that by 2090, £1 billion will buy what £5 does today. So I think I would have a pint and think about it. Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed. And now we have a gentleman at the front here, and then the lady next to him. So, thank you.
Thank you. My name's Peter Upton. I'm an agricultural scientist by training, but work mostly in community food growing, and recently taken an MSc in biodiversity and taxonomy of plants. My question is to Nick about, you said that food production in this country has sort of plateaued since about the 1980s and was going up until that sort of time. And what we need is more food and to get away from that plateau and start climbing again so that we can increase production. What do you say to the problem that we already have more than enough food in the world, that we waste huge amounts of food, which causes untold environmental destruction, adding nitrous oxides to the atmosphere and CO2 and burnt diesel, and then we drive the food to landfill sites or incinerate it. It's a big pollution problem. Surely the problem is more to do with distribution of food than growing more of the stuff, which is already incredibly destructive environmentally. And at what point do you see increases in agricultural production per hectare reaching the next plateau? You can't go on increasing indefinitely.
Thank you.
Do you want me to?
Yes, please.
I mean, you're right, and I did say at the outset that it's not just about increasing productivity. I absolutely agree. You need to look at reducing waste. You need to look at distribution. You need to look at diets as well. All of those are going to have a role to play. But the FAO of the UN, the Food and Agriculture Organization, has estimated that there will need to be, alongside other measures, an increase of 70% in food production to 2050. Now, you again, I think it's fair to point out that there are parts of the world where clearly there is overconsumption of food and obesity is problems, etc. And that possibly matches crudely those areas of the world where there's malnutrition and even starvation. But at the same time, we are going to get, as I said, 200,000 extra people on the planet a day. We're going to have another 2 billion people on the planet by that 2050. From my perspective, I would be deeply concerned if we said, well, let's just take productivity, increasing productivity out of the picture. I don't believe that we're going to get there. The FAO of the UN doesn't believe we're going to get there. Now, you do make the important point about, well, how do you... This is the challenge of sustainable intensification. How do you do that? How do you look to increase productivity while trying to take care of some of those environmental concerns and the environmental impacts of agriculture? Now, that is an incredibly difficult question. For example, one solution might be, well, let's return to a more organic approach to agriculture, and a lower input approach to agriculture. But there can be no doubt that that is a lower yield agriculture that will require more land to produce the same amount of food. My alternative would be one where you actually try to intensify production on a smaller amount of agricultural land, allowing more land uncultivated for environmental, for conservation, for biodiversity, however you want to put it. But actually, you're trying to produce more from less, and that actually gives you more land, which is not cultivated, and so the problems you raised were around cultivated land. So let's look at technologies like GM where you might be able to do that.
Yes, who's going to stop? Who's going to cause a? Who's going to stop? No, I can't think of my question. It's there's as I said, there's already too much food produced, and if you have more productive land on less area, who's going to stop that? Capitalism will ensure that more and more land is taken over in order to grow more food, even more food, in order to make mega corporations and mega food growers richer.
Possibly, but I mean, at the moment, there are public expenditure on farmers to have conservation headlands and to cultivate only certain amounts of their land. I mean, there's lots of examples of farmers being incentivized not to grow on land. And secondly, you're right, if capitalism is sensitive to it, well, farmers don't like spending lots of money on lots of inputs and spending lots of money if they're not going to get returns. Actually, having clever agriculture intensified on smaller areas of land which require less inputs is actually an attractive, cost-effective way of farming as well. I mean, this is, you're trying to incentivize people to move to that sort of farming.
Move it to the next lady. Thank you very much. Oh, it's been asked. Thank you very much. So there is a question at the front here, number 1, and then number 2 further back. Just up there.
Thank you very much. Alex Quayle, I'm actually an engineer in the energy industry. So I'm coming at this as a scientist, but not someone who's got a specialist interest in this industry. And I hope that's interesting because I think many people in the public are probably in the same position as myself. Just a reflection, and I'd like to hear the feedback from the panel on this, a reflection on the announcement by the Scottish Government, which we were discussing in our little adjourn, was really to do with what the voters were probably pushing for. The question then is, what do the voters think, and are they being educated about this sufficiently? Are they scientifically engaged about this? Or are we trapped in some kind of hysteria because we haven't got that scientific conversation really going? So I'd like to hear the feedback on that. And then I'd like to throw a couple of scientific conversation questions out. We talked earlier about drought-resistant crops being developed. What happens if we get an extremely successful drought-resistant weed developing somewhere that takes over, Japanese knotweed of our fields, takes everything over? What happens if we are supplying modified rice to Asian farmers who are low technology and they start to get a blight that damages that, how do we make sure that there's a backup plan, that there's something else there for them? And the more we move towards a sort of monoculture and intensification that's been discussed here today, we want the most successful variety, we want it everywhere. Well, that's fine until at some point it develops a problem. How do we recover from that? So a couple of questions I'd like to hear some discussion on. Be very grateful for any input.
Okay, thank you. You started with basically the scientific understanding of the public. So could we perhaps explore that first? Jim, you haven't said too much lately.
Okay. Comes back to things I hinted at when we started. I was part of some of these Ipsos Mori focus groups last year, and it's quite clear that I was just doing it for two groups of quite contrasting individuals. One was an afternoon group of a dozen mums who were on the way to pick up their kids from school. And their view was they thought GM was everywhere anyway. They didn't know why, but that's what they'd kind of absorbed. They weren't very bothered. What bothered them was just having safe, sustainable food on the plate for the kids when they came home. And as long as it was good quality food that came from the supermarkets that they trusted, that was the level of interest, because that was their priority. Understandably so. They didn't really want to know all the science behind it. And there is a sort of long-term view on that the more science you try and give to people, sometimes the reaction is, I don't want to hear that. I was involved nearly 20 years ago. Science Museum ran a campaign, one of these, educate people and then it'll be fine, which is kind of patronizing, and the response was the opposite. That the more you sit people down and talk about all these things, then the more they say, this is making matters worse. So there's some quite interesting sociology and human behaviour that has to be involved in that process. It's not just simply telling the facts like that. But other groups of people from a different background, maybe who had time to think about the science, other groups of professional people, then they were interested in the science. So society is fragmented, and different groups of people have quite different priorities in their lives. So to some people, it's not really important. They just want safe, secure food. Other ones, they want as much science as you can give them, because that's what makes them interested. So there isn't a single answer to all of this.
Thank you. Nico, Stephen.
Yes, can I comment on some of the earlier questions as well? Veganism, unless you're an animal rights activist and don't wear leather, incidentally, there's no point in being vegan on climate and environment terms. What I would say there is a strong case for is not eating beef. I can say that because I don't like beef. I like cheese, so my moral purity collapses at that point. But beef is the worst in climate terms. Avoiding the iceberg with the Titanic, yes. Population control, you said it was too late. Well, it's
by 2090.
by 2090, yes. I mean, already too many people. Economic development is, and particularly healthcare, is a very good way of reducing population control, because to be honest, people have lots of babies in the developing world, firstly because they don't have family planning applications, and that Pope Francis is moving on that, so fingers crossed. But also, there's high child mortality, and which is tragic, but they want to have lots of children so that they know that there are some still alive in their old age, to look after them in their old age. So economic development is absolutely crucial. Whether we can avoid the iceberg, I don't know. Food waste, yes, there is far too much of it, so we should cut down on it. We should deal with sell-by dates and so on. But when there is some food waste, and there will always be some, it should be used in anaerobic digestion to produce low-carbon energy, which is another of my obsessions. And finally, you said you're all arguing for the best crop being grown in monocultures in large areas. Well, I'm not, and I don't really think the others are either. I mean, to me, GM is part of the solution. It's not the whole solution. Monocultures are not good. Crop rotation seems to make absolute sense, both in terms of agriculture and in terms of environmental protection. Some of the traditional crops that used to be grown in sub-Saharan Africa, for example, are now not grown because of the extensive, aggressive marketing by agribusiness. So let's roll that back and go for traditional crops as well, as part of the answer, alongside GM crops. So it's a very diverse picture.
Thank you very much. There are two other questions. Did I miss anybody else? No, one in a blue shirt and one in a blue shirt and one in a non-blue shirt. Thank you.
Alan Archibald, the Russell Institute, University of Edinburgh. Just a few comments. There's an element on the anti-side of the argument that agriculture gets demonized. Agriculture is the most important industry on the planet. We wouldn't be sitting in this room if it wasn't for organised agriculture. It's allowed us time to sit and read books, to engage in all sorts of activities that wouldn't be possible if you're spending your time tilling your back garden trying to get enough food to eat. So I take exception to the idea of allowing folk in Africa to maintain their subsistence existence. Their kids aren't getting to school a lot of the time because their kids are at home helping their parents to raise enough food so they can eat. We've talked about controlling population. Yes, it would be highly desirable if we dampen down the population size. The way that applies in this country and in Germany and Italy is that we're solving our lack of population growth at the present by bringing in people from other countries, young people from other countries, so they'll look after me in my old age, and so they'll pay my pension contributions in my old age. If we damp down population growth, we've got to accept the fact that as we grow older, we're going to have to work longer, and we're going to have a shorter period, like our grandparents did, enjoying the benefits of life and a pension. For those who are on the anti-side of the argument, I pose the question, which of the crops that we currently eat are the result of random mutagenesis with chemicals or radiation are you going to ban retrospectively and say they're off the list? So we're going to take this blunderbuss, the products of this blunderbuss approach to genetic modification, but reject the ones where we make precise changes. And if we're using genome editing technology where we can change a single letter in the genetic code of a species, out there somewhere on the planet, that same change exists. But frankly, we don't have long enough to hunt for it.
Thank you very much indeed. Gentleman here.
John Frank, Canadian University of Edinburgh, epidemiologist. So we haven't talked very much about what would we want to see in place. Should we mispredict the safety by our pre-marketing testing? And as I think everyone in the room knows, we never know the safety of new vaccines and drugs until hundreds of thousands to millions of people have used them for many years. We never really know because our predictive basic science is not up to it. So for introducing, however safe we think they are, new kinds of food into the system, I very much like Stephen's point that it would be important to be able to go back and look at what foods people ate, if they chose different kinds of brands and so forth, and have the two streams separated. As a Canadian, that proved to be impossible. It was judged to be uneconomical. And I can tell you that if I was asked as an epidemiologist to design a study because someone had started to show up, people had started to show up with nutritional deficiency syndromes, and there was some implication, I would not be able to do the study because there's no way to ascertain the exposure to GMOs in the American food system. So I'm worried that we might be right, but if we're wrong, we will not be able to show it unless we can sort out what North America could not.
But I suspect there are a few other questions that could be related to lack of health benefit that equally epidemiologists will not be able to answer because, again, we don't know about the exposure to many, many things. Cigarette smoking is one, you do, alcohol, you do, etc. But many other things are a problem.
Can I just respond
Please.
to that? I mean, yeah, very, very interesting. it's quite striking that I'm not aware of any lawsuit based on GM health damage in North America. And the US is quite a litigious place, so I'm assuming that that means nobody has been able to assemble any evidence. But from what you said, that's because it was impossible to see what they'd been eating. So can Europe sort it out? Well, over to you.
And a further question in the middle, and I'm afraid this will have to be the last question. Yes, just in the middle there next to.
Just 2 points. One, should Monsanto have sacked their marketing team right at the start instead of telling everybody, eventually we can bring in saline-tolerant crops? Would it not have been better to do that first and then get rid of all of the hassle? Because everybody would have welcomed the development of more productive crops right after. Sorry, my name is John McHenry. I work for a vet medicines company. In the vet medicine field, we have to submit environmental assessments for every product that we launch. We get a 5-year license, and if the Veterinary Medicines Directorate don't like or aren't sure about something, they can say, monitor this. Give us the report when you come back for your renewal in 5 years' time. If they don't like it, they pull the plug, we've lost the product. So we have systems in place that we could control if they just applied it across the board.
But that same principle applies to GM cultivation.
Thank you all very, very, very much. You've been a fantastic audience. While I accept that we may not have been as broad a group as you would have liked, I hope you have still found this group of panellists we have here tonight very stimulating. And I'd like you to thank them now in the usual way. But before you go, could I please now have the final show of hands to the question we asked before about GM food on our tables? How many of you are against the use of GM to put in genes into crops that will result as food on our tables? A show of hands, please. Thank you very, very much indeed. I hope you enjoyed tonight. The Royal Society has a further event, a summer science exhibition from the 4th to the 10th of July, which I assume is in London. So we will have many more events here in Edinburgh, and we look forward to seeing you here. Thank you all very much.